By 3 that Saturday, the ceramics center smelled like coffee, wet clay, and too many winter coats. Our anniversary sale had filled the lobby, while adaptive students worked at the low tables behind me, and I was halfway through checking a refund when a woman set a small blue bowl and a receipt on my desk. "I bought this here last night," she said. "The glaze is cracked." I took the bowl, then looked at the receipt. The center's address was printed beneath a merchant name I didn't recognize, although our authorized system had one profile, one account, and one refund procedure. This showed a second merchant. "I'm sorry," I said. "I need to verify the transaction before I issue anything." She glanced toward the display shelves. "Mara told me it was fine. She and Luis were here." My hand stopped above the keyboard. Mara was my wife and our weekend sale organizer, while Luis Ortega was her wholesale partner, an independent ceramicist with no authority over me or the center. "Here?" I asked. "Last night after closing," she said, pointing toward the studio doors. "They said the sale was part of a private collection." Behind her, a student asked for help adjusting a wheel, and I answered him first because the program was open and his work mattered more than the panic rising in my chest. I saved the receipt through the ordinary incident procedure, including the customer's voluntary account of the purchase. I didn't photograph her or ask where she lived. Instead, I marked the matching blue pieces and 2 nearby items as disputed, then froze only their sale and refund path. June Bell, a longtime member who had been sorting donated mugs, watched me tape the notice to the shelf. "Are you closing the sale?" she asked. "Not the sale," I said. "Just these pieces until I know what happened." Mara heard my answer from the doorway, and I felt the room change around a question I could not yet name. Her expression tightened, but she said nothing as I opened the public closure schedule on my screen and searched last night's date. If the building had been closed, the receipt wasn't a terminal mistake. It was a door someone had opened. The sale ended at 6, but I stayed in my office with the door open and the lights on, keeping the customer's receipt beside our public calendar while I checked the posted schedule against the class log. Last night had been listed as a closed maintenance evening with no instruction, workshop, or sale scheduled after 5. That left several harmless possibilities. Someone could have used the wrong merchant profile, a terminal could have retained an old address, or the customer could have misunderstood which building she visited. I checked the center's authorized payment account without opening anyone's private account. The unfamiliar profile wasn't connected to it, although its registered address was ours and the transaction time fell 43 minutes after the final staff member should have left. I went to the kiln room and pulled the access binder from the cabinet. The pages smelled faintly of ash and detergent, and a month earlier Mara had asked for one reserved kiln slot for a rush of weekend sale pieces. I'd let her use it after promising myself I'd correct the scheduling later. I had called it a courtesy, but the center's policy called it an exception requiring documentation. The entry was there, but thin. No full inventory, no second staff signature, and no clear explanation of what she'd fired. I had accepted her word because she was my wife, because we were short on time, and because I managed too many small emergencies to treat everyone like a disciplinary hearing. That compromise suddenly looked less small once the second merchant profile entered the same picture. I started a formal incident file attaching the receipt, the public closure schedule, and my own note about the reserved kiln slot. I wrote only what I could support: an unknown merchant profile, a closed night transaction, and a prior access exception, while leaving out guesses about motive, relationships, and anything the customer hadn't volunteered. The file number appeared at the top of the page, and seeing it, there changed the room. The problem no longer belonged only to my marriage or my memory. It belonged to the center's duty of care and possibly to the professional certifications I signed each quarter. Tessa Reed had closed the building that night. She was our senior instructor, and her classes depended on the hours I controlled. If you want to stay with me through the evidence, keep listening. The receipt mattered, but the person who locked the doors mattered more. I found Tessa's number in the staff directory and stared at it until the office clock clicked forward, then wrote her name on the file. Tessa met me the next morning in the empty hand building room. Sunlight came through the high windows in pale rectangles, catching dust above the work tables, while her first class started in 40 minutes and she kept glancing at the clock. "I need to ask about access last night," I said. "Only access, timing, and anything you directly observed." Her shoulders lowered a fraction. "Am I in trouble?" "No, and I'm not asking you to repeat rumors." She folded her hands around a paper cup and said, "I locked the front door at 5:12. I checked the kiln room, the glazed shelves, and the back entrance, then went outside to move my car. When I asked how long she was gone, she said, "Maybe 3 minutes. 4. When you came back, what did you see?" "I saw Mara's car near the loading door." I waited while Tessa looked toward the unused wheels along the wall. "Was anyone with her?" "Luis Ortega." "Did you see them enter?" "Yes. They used the side door. Mara had a key." That answer landed harder than the receipt, but I kept my pen moving. "What did you observe after that?" "Nothing about a sale. I came back later for my scarf." She swallowed. "The lobby lights were off, but the studio light was on. I saw Mara and Luis near the wedging table. When I asked what they were doing, Tessa looked directly at me. They embraced, not a greeting. They held each other and he kissed her." I stopped writing, and the room seemed to contract around the two of us. "Anything else you can state from your own observation?" "They were alone. I didn't hear a customer, I didn't see money change hands, and I left." I read the statement back slowly, preserving her times and removing every word that sounded like interpretation. Tessa corrected 1 minute and crossed out "secretly," which I had written without noticing. "I don't know what this means," she said. "I know what I saw. That's all I need." "No, it's not all you need," she said. "But it's all I can give you." I gave her the page and let her read it twice. She signed only after correcting the time, then took a copy for herself. Her classes, her income, and her access to the center were all tied to people who could make this difficult. I closed the binder. I knew enough to speak to Mara, but not enough to accuse her of everything, so at home, I would ask 2 questions and keep them separate. Mara sat across from me at our kitchen table that night, still wearing the gray sweatshirt she used for glazing. The house was quiet, except for the refrigerator cycling on, and I placed the receipt and Tessa's signed timing statement between us, face down. "I'm asking about the center first," I said. "Then I'm asking about us." Mara's eyes moved to the papers. "You're making a customer complaint into an investigation. The building was closed. A second merchant profile used our address. Your car was there with Luis. Because the center is bleeding money, Evan." That doesn't answer the access question. It answers the important question. We needed a way to bring in revenue without waiting for another grant cycle. I kept my voice level. "Who authorized the profile?" She leaned back. "Does it matter if the sales helped?" "Yes. I manage the programs, the inventory, and the records. I can't certify a system I don't understand. You certify plenty of things you barely have time to inspect." The words were sharp but not wrong enough to dismiss, and I thought of the kiln slot I'd allowed her before setting that thought aside for the moment. "Are there other pieces?" I asked. "Some pieces were mine." "Made where?" She looked at me then. Her face held anger first, and something underneath it that looked like calculation. "I'll answer if you listen," she said. "Not as my manager, as the person who knows why I started doing it. I'll listen. And you won't pretend this is only about a cracked bowl. It isn't." I turned the papers over. Tessa's statement stayed brief, with no rumor, motive, or private detail beyond what she had witnessed, and I told Mara that the inventory request applied to every piece connected to the disputed sale, whether she considered it personal or commercial. She pushed the receipt away. "You want an inventory because you've already decided what I did." "I want an inventory because I don't know what you did." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Mara drew a slow breath and placed both hands flat on the table. "All right," she said. "Listen to why the label exists." Mara told me the label had started in the spring, after the center lost a grant and cut 2 adaptive session blocks. She and Luis had made small production runs in the studio, sold them through the second merchant profile, and used the proceeds to keep certain supplies available. That was the version she wanted me to hear first. It had a financial emergency, a useful purpose, and enough truth to make anger feel temporarily unfair. "How long?" I asked. "The label?" "The relationship." She looked down at the seam in the tabletop. "Months. With Luis." The word didn't echo. It simply settled between us, heavier than the receipt and heavier than the signed statement. I had imagined denial, tears, maybe an accusation that I'd misunderstood. I hadn't imagined her answering like she was correcting a date on a form. When I asked whether Dean knew, Mara said he knew about the pilot access, but not everything they made. "Was the pilot written?" Not the way you mean. And the sales? Some were private, some were for buyers Luis already had. The center needed income, Evan. You used the center to build a business with him. I used space we had available because everyone kept saying there was no money. You used my access. She flinched, then straightened. You gave me the kiln slot. I gave you one kiln slot. I didn't give you a second merchant account or permission to sell after closing. I know that. The admission made the room colder. I asked how many pieces were involved, but Mara said she needed to review the records before answering. I didn't press for graphic details or ask her to describe the affair. I needed identity, duration, and the connection to center access. I had those facts now, and none of them could be repaired by learning more. I'm sleeping in the guest room, I said, her mouth tightened. You're deciding that tonight? I'm deciding that we can't keep pretending the house is unchanged. She nodded once. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking you to stop working. I'm saying the institutional inquiry continues without using our marriage as its procedure. Mara gathered the papers and returned them to me. You'll make me the whole story. I won't. But I won't make the center's records disappear to protect us either. I drove for 20 minutes afterward, with no destination. The roads were dark, the storefronts closing one by one, and grief moved through me in clean administrative lines. Separate rooms, separate schedules, preserve the stock. By the time I parked, the label was no longer a secret between two people. It was a conflict the center had to contain. The next morning, I arrived before the adaptive sessions and found Mara beside the storage racks with 2 empty crates and a list written in her narrow handwriting. These are mine, she said. I'm taking them off-site. Tessa was unlocking the hand-building room behind us while June Bell stood near the bulletin board, reading the class schedule with the careful suspicion she brought to every board notice. Neither woman spoke until I finished posting the hold. It said only that certain inventory was disputed and could not be moved, sold, fired, or refunded until a neutral count was complete. It didn't mention the affair or identify protected participants, and it didn't close a single scheduled class. Tessa looked at the notice. Are my sessions still running? Yes, I said. Your access remains unchanged today. Today? Until the board adopts written terms, no one loses hours because of an unverified story. June turned from the bulletin board. What's verified? A transaction, a closure schedule, and disputed inventory, I said. The rest is being handled through the incident process. Mara lifted one of the crates. You're freezing pieces that belong to me. I'm holding pieces whose custody isn't clear. You could ask me instead of treating me like a thief. I am asking you, in writing, with a witness present. June glanced between us. Who's the witness? I've asked you to observe the count, I said. You're a member, not my employee, and you don't report to me. She considered that. And the board? I'm notifying them of a management conflict without marital detail. The count will separate center stock, private stock, and disputed pieces. Mara set the crate down harder than necessary. You're making a public spectacle. No. I'm making the categories visible. Tessa entered the classroom, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'll give you what I personally saw. Nothing more. That's exactly what I need. The first students began arriving. A parent waved through the glass, and Tessa went to greet them while June picked up a clipboard. Mara stayed beside the racks, her face closed, as I wrote the board notice and signed my name beneath it. The marriage had given her informal control over stock, and that control ended with the posted hold. At 10, wholesale pickup records arrived in a thick envelope, showing dates and quantities I hadn't known existed. I carried them into the office while the adaptive class began behind me. The receipt had opened the question, and the pickup history would tell me its scale. 2 days after the hold went up, I met Mara and Luis in the loading area before the first delivery arrived. The roll-up door was half open, letting in cold air and the smell of wet pavement. Between us sat 3 bankers' boxes labeled with dates, quantities, and the name of a private buyer network. Luis Ortega was Mara's wholesale partner, an independent ceramicist with no authority over me or the center. I had seen his name on invoices. I hadn't seen him stand inside my workplace with a key ring clipped to his belt. Mara kept one hand on the top box. These are the pickup records we could find. Could find. Some buyers paid directly, Luis said. Those weren't center transactions. That doesn't answer the question. He looked at Mara, then back at me. We're trying to identify what belongs to the label. I opened the first box. The records were selective, but the dates formed a pattern. Pickups appeared in late spring, then summer, then nearly every other week through the fall. Quantities varied from 6 pieces to more than 20. The after-hours receipt wasn't an isolated experiment. It was one mark in a production schedule that had been running for months. Mara's voice softened. We were keeping the place alive. You were producing commercial work here. We were using available capacity, without recording it through the center. Because the center couldn't afford another committee. The answer carried enough truth to make the lie more durable. Our operating deficit was real. So were the canceled classes, the deferred repairs, and the supplies I had learned to order in smaller batches. But financial need didn't turn private sales into center revenue. In the member lounge, Luis had already placed a one-page proposal beside the coffee urn. It described an incubator program, shared production hours, and a percentage of sales directed toward adaptive programming. No names appeared, but everyone understood who had written it. June Bell read the page with her arms folded. She was the long-term member who checked every claim independently, especially when closure and capture were presented as the only choices. People are frightened by the deficit, she said. I know. Luis stepped closer. Then let us show them a workable answer. Show them your proposal, I said. Don't use center buyer or vendor information to recruit for it. I need access to those contacts to separate private stock from center stock. No, I'll arrange an item-by-item process with authorized records. His expression tightened. That makes identification impossible. It makes it accountable. He asked for the vendor list anyway, as if repeating the request could create permission. I kept the office door between us and the files inside. The pickup history had answered one question. The label had duration. Now I had to keep its private network from becoming the center's recruiting list. By that afternoon, Luis was waiting outside my office when I returned from the sales gallery. He stood beneath the framed anniversary photographs, holding a clipboard like it gave him standing. I'm not asking for participant information, he said. I'm asking for buyer names connected to disputed pieces. You're asking for center records. Some of those buyers purchased work made under our label. Then bring the receipts that establish that. He glanced through the open doorway at the shelves behind me. We can resolve this in an hour if you share the list. That was precisely the shortcut I couldn't allow. The center's buyers included donors, members, vendors, and people who had purchased adaptive work without wanting further contact. A private label couldn't inherit those relationships because its stock had occupied our shelves. June stood at the end of the gallery, observing without interrupting. I picked up the inventory form and carried it to the counter. We'll identify each piece by description, date, maker mark, and available transaction record, I said. No private buyer list. Luis gave a humorless laugh. You're protecting the center from information it already owns. I'm protecting people from having their information repurposed. Mara came through the gallery doors carrying a stack of unsold bowls. As Evan's wife and the center's weekend sale organizer, she could speak to me as a spouse, a vendor, or a conversion advocate. She chose the last one. Luis needs a way to contact the buyers, she said, not through my office. You're making this personal. The buyer list is institutional, regardless of our marriage. June stepped closer. What's the alternative? Neutral count. 2 observers. Each disputed item gets a temporary number. Whoever claims it provides supporting records through the incident channel. Luis tapped the clipboard against his palm. And if the records are incomplete, then the item stays disputed until they are reconciled. He looked toward Mara. That could take weeks. It may, I said. The center isn't obligated to make your commercial network easier to manage. His jaw shifted, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he wrote something on his clipboard and left through the side door. I documented the request, my refusal, and the process I had offered. It felt excessive until I remembered how quickly informal access had become invisible production. The neutral count was scheduled for Saturday morning. I checked the key log, then checked it again. The question had changed from who made the pieces to who could touch them, when, and under whose custody. Saturday morning, I unlocked the glaze room with Tessa beside me and a bored observer following at a deliberate distance. The rooms were cold and dim. Every surface held some version of our confusion. Center clay beside private clay, sale tags beneath unlabeled pieces, glaze buckets marked only with initials. Mara waited by the inventory shelves. She had tied her hair back and brought her own notebook. I'm here to identify my work, she said. You can identify what you claim. The records determine the category. Her eyes hardened. You still think I'm trying to take something. I think we need categories that don't depend on trust. Tessa said nothing. She was the senior instructor whose classes depended on center access and whose knowledge was limited to timing and direct observation. Her presence here was about process, not the affair. We began with the shelves closest to the kiln. Center-owned materials went on the left. Mara's documented private stock went on the right. Pieces with unclear origin or disputed sales went on the middle shelf, each marked with a temporary number and photographed for the file. Mara challenged several placements. That glaze was mine. Do you have a purchase record? I bought it in bulk. For the center? For the label. Then it goes right, if the receipt matches the amount. She exhaled through her nose. You're enjoying this? No. The board observer recorded the challenge and moved to the next item. Tessa checked the shelf numbers against the form. By noon, the room looked less like a shared studio and more like a place where custody could be seen. I added a signed access sheet to the door. Anyone entering the locked rooms would record the time, purpose, and items moved. Scheduled classes remained open. Private commercial work could be collected only through the documented process. Mara signed the disputed item page without agreeing with it. Tessa signed as a process witness. I signed last. For the first time since the receipt, the air in my chest loosened. The marriage was still broken. The inventory wasn't. As we left, Tessa held the pen between both hands. Will giving a statement cost me my teaching access? The question followed me down the hall. A clean process could still harm the person who made it possible. After Tessa's adaptive class ended, I found her in the small workroom behind the hand-building studio. She was wiping clay from a table while the last participants gathered coats outside. The room smelled of soap, damp earth, and the citrus cleaner she used on every surface. I put in a written anti-retaliation request, I said. She stopped wiping. For me? For anyone giving evidence or participating in the count. It asks the board to keep schedules and access unchanged unless there's a documented operational reason. Can you guarantee that? No. I can request it and put the request where everyone can see it. She nodded, though the answer didn't comfort her. Tessa's classes paid part of her rent. A lost evening wasn't an abstract consequence for her. I don't want to be treated like a witness every time I walk in, she said. You won't be involved in further inventory decisions. That sounds like protection and exclusion at the same time. It's separation. Your statement should stand on what you saw, not on whether you helped me sort shelves. She folded the cleaning cloth. Dean controls the schedule. I know. And Mara still runs the weekend sale. Only within the written hold. Tessa looked toward the hallway. People are already saying you're angry because of the affair. I am angry because of several things. That doesn't make your account less precise. I didn't say it did. I'm not asking you to defend me. Her face eased slightly. Good. I wouldn't know how. I filed the request before leaving the office. It named no participant, described no therapy session, and asked that protected schedules remain protected. Access could establish a timeline without exposing the people those classes served. Near dinner, Mara sent me a message. Dean already authorized a pilot. Ask him before you call the whole thing unauthorized. I read it twice. The word pilot carried a narrowness that mattered. It could mean a limited trial, a few scheduled hours, or a convenient label placed over months of use. I copied the message into the agreed incident channel and wrote a factual note beneath it. I didn't ask Mara to delay, soften, or coordinate her account with mine. By evening, the issue had acquired a new boundary. Dean would have to answer as board chair, not simply reassure me as my oldest friend. The cafe was halfway between our house and the center, which made it useful for practical meetings and terrible for anything that resembled comfort. Mara sat across from me with her coat still on. I kept the incident folder closed between us. You copied my message, she said. I did. You could have asked what I meant first. I'm asking now. She looked through the window at traffic moving across the wet street. Dean approved a pilot for commercial production. Limited access. He said it could test whether an incubator would work. When? Before the pickups became regular. Did he approve the second merchant profile? No. Did he approve Luis using center storage? Not as an open-ended arrangement. Did he approve the sales? Not every sale. Her answers were careful, but they moved the ground beneath the inquiry. Until then, the access had appeared to be private misuse by Mara and Luis. Now the board's authority might sit somewhere inside it. "Do you have the approval in writing?" I asked. Mara unlocked her phone and scrolled. "I have a message. From Dean?" "Yes. May I copy it into the incident file?" She hesitated. "If you do, you'll make him part of this." "He is part of it if he approved access." "He was trying to save the center. So were you." "That's different." "Tell me how." She placed the phone on the table and turned it toward me. The message was brief. Dean referred to a small pilot, approved limited after-hours testing, and asked Mara to keep the scope manageable while the board considered a formal proposal. There was no permission for the months of pickups, no authorization for private buyer sales, no mention of the affair. I didn't need the message to prove more than it said. I copied it through the agreed channel and returned the phone. Mara's shoulders lowered. "I need time before you confront him." "You've had time." "That's not fair." "No, it's not." She looked at me then, and for a moment the cafe disappeared. She was my wife, frightened of becoming the only person blamed. I was still the man she had betrayed, frightened that my oldest friend had helped create the conditions I was responsible for certifying. "I won't bargain over the marriage," I said, "and I won't trade silence for cooperation. I'm not asking you to lie. You're asking me to wait while the chair controls the records." Her mouth tightened. "Ask him formally." "I will." I sent Dean a meeting request before leaving the cafe. It named the pilot reference, the pickup history, and the need for independent record custody. Friendship could explain why he acted. It couldn't decide how the center investigated him. Dean's board conference room still held the same long table where we had planned the adaptive program years earlier. He had been my oldest friend before he became the current board chair, and I had to keep those roles separate while he sat at the head of the table. June was already there with a legal pad. She was the long-term member who checked claims independently and represented people afraid of both closure and capture. Dean gestured toward the empty chair beside him. "You didn't need to make this formal?" "I requested formal because the issue concerns your chair authority. It concerns Mara's misuse of access. It may concern more than that." His expression closed. "You're upset. I understand why. Then answer the questions." I placed copies of the pickup timeline and Mara's pilot message on the table. I kept the customer's protected information out of the packet, including anything that could identify the adaptive participants whose classes established building access. Dean didn't touch the papers. "Mara told you about the pilot. She gave me the exact message. An informal trial isn't approval for everything that followed." "I agree." June wrote something down. Dean noticed. "You're treating a budget experiment like a criminal proceeding?" he said. "No. I'm treating a governance question like a governance question." He leaned back. "The center was facing a serious deficit. We needed options. If we'd waited for 3 committees and a full proposal, we might have lost the program." "You approved after-hours testing?" "I approved a limited pilot." The words were precise, almost rehearsed. They didn't yet explain who had keys, what records were required, or when the trial ended. "Where are the approval records?" I asked. "With the board files." "Who has custody?" "I do." "That's a conflict." Dean's eyes sharpened. "You're accusing me because your wife had an affair." "I'm separating those facts. The access issue exists even if Mara and Luis had never touched each other." June looked up. "That separation needs to remain in the record." Dean gave her a tired smile. "You don't know the history here." "I know what's been posted, what's been sold, and what the notices say." "I can handle Mara privately," he said. "She's already agreed to cooperate. She can answer for her conduct. You answer for your office." His hand pressed flat against the folder. "If you push this through the full channel, the center may not survive the attention. If I don't, my certification and the center's records may not survive the concealment." For several seconds, the room held only the hum of the air conditioner. Dean finally pulled the papers toward him. "I'll answer on the record." "Through the full review channel?" "Yes." He looked at me as my friend then, and I refused to look back that way. "The pilot was necessary," he said. "That part won't change." "The pilot was necessary," Dean said. "That part won't change." "Necessary doesn't mean unlimited." "I didn't say it did." "Then tell us what it covered." Dean looked at June, then at me. "A small commercial test. 2 evenings, maybe 3. Mara could use the kiln after regular programming. Luis could bring in sample pieces and see whether buyers responded. Were sales authorized? Samples could be sold. Through which merchant account? He paused. I don't know anything about a second account. Who approved access after those first evenings? I assumed Mara was managing the details. You gave her keys? She already had operational access. As my friend, Dean knew exactly what that answer meant. As chair, he knew it was too vague to survive a review. June tapped the pilot message. This says the board would consider a formal proposal after testing. It doesn't say the trial could continue indefinitely. It didn't continue indefinitely, Dean said. It got out of hand. Months of pickups isn't a spillover, I said. It's a different operation. His jaw tightened. Mara and Luis exceeded the scope without telling me. I found out later. When? After the sales had started? Before or after you changed the access paperwork? The room went quiet. Dean's eyes held mine. I didn't change anything to hide sales. That isn't my question. You're making assumptions. I'm asking for dates. He gathered the papers into a neat stack, keeping the pages with him. I'll provide the written pilot account. To whom? The board. The board includes people who benefit from the conversion proposal. June's pen stopped. Neutral custody is reasonable. Dean turned toward her. You're asking me to surrender board records because Evan is angry. I'm asking for ordinary custody during an active conflict review. That landed harder than my questions. Dean had built the center with me, fundraised through bad years, and defended the adaptive program when larger donors wanted easier projects. I knew why he feared a public failure. I also knew fear didn't make a conflict disappear. I'll place copies with counsel, he said. The originals stay with the chair. No personal copies, I said. No edits after submission. No restricting staff access as retaliation. His expression hardened. Don't lecture me about retaliation. Tessa's classes depend on your scheduling decisions. She's not being punished. Then her access won't be conditional. Dean pushed back from the table. You've already decided what happened. No. I've decided the record can't be built around friendship. I added the pilot reference to my conflict disclosure before leaving the room. The explanation had changed from one couple's concealed operation to a board-authorized doorway. Dean's approval entered the record, but its limits remained contested. The documents needed a neutral custodian before their dates became anyone's memory. The next morning, I met Dean in the records room with two bankers' boxes between us. The center smelled of damp clay and copier toner. I still had a manager's access card, but I didn't use it to open anything beyond the files listed in the review notice. Dean stood beside the locked cabinet. I said I'd provide the pilot account. You said counsel could hold copies. That's what we're doing. You're still selecting what gets copied. He gave me a flat look. Because I'm the chair. Because you're a named party. The outside counsel's intake call began at 9. The attorney didn't ask us to argue about motive. She asked for the record categories, the existing retention schedule, and who had physical and electronic control. I answered what I knew. Dean answered less. When she asked whether either of us had altered, recreated, or supplemented an approval document after the fact, Dean said, "Not to my knowledge." I wrote the phrase down. Counsel directed the center to place the board files under neutral custody. A custodian would receive the originals, log each item, and issue an index to the involved parties. Neither Dean nor I could make personal duplicates or remove pages for private review. Dean's chair access remained intact for ordinary operations. His control over the disputed records did not. He slid a folder across the table. This is the pilot packet. It contained a 1-page summary, a draft schedule, and 3 access forms. The forms carried effective dates in March. A typed notation at the bottom referred to a board discussion in May. I checked the dates twice. Was this packet created together? I asked. It reflects the same arrangement. That doesn't answer when each page was created. The custodian can determine that. The sentence sounded responsible until I remembered he had resisted the custodian an hour earlier. Counsel requested the folder, and Dean handed it over. I surrendered my card before leaving the records room. The reviewer's notice said I could receive an authorized index, but no unrestricted administrative access while the conflict was open. Giving up the card felt like losing a small piece of my body. It also removed the easiest accusation against me. I couldn't enter a system and quietly search for proof. I could only request what the process allowed. June received the custody notice that afternoon. She replied with one sentence. Please include public member schedules in the index request. I told her I would. That evening, the custodian flagged incompatible creation and effective dates in the pilot packet. The pilot might have been weak, informal governance. The dates could make it something more serious. By Wednesday, the center was running on a shortened staff schedule. Dean had centralized the keys, the board files, and instructor scheduling under his office. He said the arrangement protected the review. Tessa heard it as a warning because her next month of classes depended on his signature. I found her in the workroom after the morning adaptive session. She was wiping clay from a row of low tables. "Dean moved your Thursday class," I said. "Moved it where?" "Into the smaller room. He says the main studio is reserved for inventory control. That room can't fit the wheel stations." "I know." She set the cloth down. He asked whether I was still comfortable teaching while the investigation continued. "What did you say?" "That I was comfortable teaching. I wasn't comfortable being tested." Her voice stayed level. Tessa was the senior instructor whose knowledge was limited to timing and direct observation. She didn't know which merchant processed a sale or what the board had approved. She knew when the building was closed, when Mara and Luis arrived, and what she had personally seen. "I'll report the scheduling pressure," I said. "Don't make it sound like I'm accusing him of something I didn't see." "I'll use your words." Dean called us into his office before lunch. The pilot account lay open beside a new key log. He had written that commercial access began in late May, after the board's informal approval. The pickup records showed Luis collecting finished pieces in April and early May. I placed the two timelines side by side. "Your account says the pilot started May 26th. That was the approved phase. Luis's pickup on May 9th includes pieces marked for the private label. Those might have been made elsewhere. The inventory count puts them in the center's kiln room." Dean's face reddened. "You're treating every date like a conviction." "I'm treating dates like dates," he pointed to the key log. "Until this is resolved, access goes through me. Tessa's classes need predictable entry. Then Tessa can cooperate with the schedule." Her shoulders went rigid. I opened the review form on my tablet. "I'm logging that condition." Dean leaned forward. "You don't get to turn operations into evidence every time you dislike a decision. I'm no longer asking permission to record an operational decision tied to a witness." That was the moment his document account became independently reviewable. He couldn't say the scheduling pressure was imaginary. I couldn't say the dates proved backdating. Both facts went into the log. Afterward, I requested public schedules, ordinary board minutes, and posted notices through the member process. I did not use restricted systems or ask Tessa for anything beyond her own schedule. The next question was harder. I had to corroborate Dean without using the access I believed he had abused. I worked from a library workstation because the center's internal files were no longer available to me. The public records portal loaded slowly, one notice at a time. I saved only documents the membership could already see: class schedules, board notices, posted meeting minutes, and the public grant reports. The chronology grew without becoming complete. A March notice listed ordinary programming. An April schedule showed the kiln room closed on the night of Luis's pickup. A May notice mentioned a possible commercial incubator but said no final proposal had been approved. The dates didn't prove who changed the forms. They did show that Dean's written account needed scrutiny. June met me in the library lobby with coffee and a yellow folder. "I checked the member bulletin archive," she said. "The first public reference to the pilot is dated after the earliest pickup you logged. Can I include that?" "It's public. Include the page and the notice date. I'm not including anything about Mara's affair." "I didn't ask you to." She looked at the forms. "What about the therapy program?" "That stays out unless the reviewer can make a lawful, privacy-safe request." June nodded. "People are already saying the program money financed the label. The separated inventory doesn't show that. Then the record has to say what it does show." Her phrase reminded me of Tessa. No one could claim more than they knew. At the workstation, I completed the authorized submission. I attached the strange receipt, the customer's non-identifying transaction information, the timing statement, the inventory categories, Dean's pilot message, the custody notice, and the public chronology. The form asked whether I had made any prior assurance relevant to the disputed access. I stared at that question for a long time. I could have answered narrowly. I had allowed Mara one kiln slot months earlier, then accepted her explanation that a small exception had been harmless. I had not opened an incident file. I had not asked whether private work continued. Later, I signed a quarterly operational assurance that reported no unresolved access exceptions. The smaller compromise had been mine. I entered a note. Prior kiln use was permitted outside ordinary procedure. I did not investigate its continuation before signing the assurance. I am disclosing this limitation and am not attributing conduct to myself that I did not authorize. The wording felt cold. It was also accurate. At the center lobby, I handed the packet to the designated intake clerk. She checked my identity, logged the submission, and gave me a receipt. I had used only what I could open, and the case was now bounded by legitimate access. The disclosure form still had one unresolved section. It asked whether additional records could establish how the commercial work affected program funding. That night, my temporary apartment sounded like a refrigerator and nothing else. I spread the disclosure copy across the small kitchen table, then read the kiln paragraph until the words stopped looking like mine. Omitting it would have been easy to defend. The disputed sales weren't mine. Dean had approved the pilot. Mara and Luis had extended it. My earlier permission had involved one slot, one explanation, and no knowledge of the second merchant account. But I had signed the assurance after that exception. The question wasn't whether I had authorized the concealed operation. The question was whether I had failed to correct a condition I had reason to examine. I added the quarter's certification date. Then I added the receipt, Tessa's timing, the inventory split, the pilot reference, and the forms with incompatible dates. I described the affair only where it explained concealed access and conflicting roles. I did not turn Mara's private betrayal into a claim about every commercial fact. The completed disclosure was 6 pages. Most of it was dates, custody, and limits. The most important sentence remained the plainest. I had seen an exception and chosen reassurance over investigation. I submitted it through the independent review channel the next morning. The intake clerk confirmed that Dean would receive notice of the filing scope. Mara received notice too. Neither was asked to respond through me, and I was grateful for that boundary. I didn't want another practical meeting to become a second marriage argument. Dean called before lunch. "You put your own name in the report," he said. "I did." "You could have separated the kiln issue." "It was relevant. It was one slot. It was an exception I didn't investigate. You're handing them a reason to take your license. I'm handing them the record." He exhaled sharply. "You think that makes you honorable?" "No. I think it makes the report usable." For the first time since the receipt appeared, I felt a sober kind of relief. The filing might damage me. It also ended my ability to shape the inquiry around other people's decisions while protecting my own. The reviewer scheduled an interview for that afternoon. Before we ended the call, she sent a request for material related to the adaptive program's funding. She said identifiable therapy records could clarify the financial analysis. I knew exactly which records she meant. I also knew I would not give them to her. The review interview took place in a plain conference room with a water pitcher, 2 chairs, and no center logo. The reviewer introduced herself by name and role, then placed my disclosure packet between us. "I need to understand whether restricted program funds supported the commercial activity," she said. "I can provide redacted totals, grant reports, and approved budget summaries. Those may not answer the question. Identifiable therapy records would answer more than the question requires." She studied me. "You're concerned about participant privacy. I'm responsible for protecting it. You're also the manager who certified the quarter." "I know." That answer changed the room. I didn't use confidentiality as a shield for my own conduct. I explained what the public and authorized records could establish. Commercial inventory had been physically separated, pickup records tracked private production, and no reviewed transaction showed money taken from therapy or scholarship accounts. The reviewer asked whether I could provide attendance records to match kiln access against therapy sessions. "Not with names or identifying details," I said. "I can provide a redacted attendance total and the public class schedule." "Could you identify the sessions without identifying participants?" "I can identify program dates. I can't provide a trail that allows someone to reconstruct individual attendance." She wrote for several seconds. I handed over the public grant reports and the redacted financial summary. The figures showed the operating deficit, the grant restrictions, and the categories where the commercial work had not been booked. They didn't prove every governance failure. They did narrow the theft question without exposing people who had trusted the center. The reviewer finally closed the folder. "I'll proceed with the narrower evidence route," she said. "I may request clarification about the certification." "I'll answer." "Even if the answer affects your standing?" "Especially then." She looked down at the first page. "Your prior assurance appears beside the kiln exception." My stomach tightened. The exception had once seemed small enough to absorb. I had told myself that a single unauthorized slot, properly cleaned and privately explained, didn't alter the center's safety or financial picture. Then I signed a quarterly certification saying there were no unresolved access concerns. The reviewer wasn't asking whether I had known about Mara and Luis. She was asking whether I had certified too much after knowing too little. "I understand," I said. Outside, the lobby doors opened for the afternoon class. Students and caregivers moved toward the workroom while I stood without a key, listening to the familiar wheels start turning. The funding question had narrowed. My authority had not been spared. The reviewer put two dates beside each other and asked me to explain the space between them. One was the kiln exception I'd tolerated months earlier. Mara had asked for a reserved slot after closing, promised to clean the equipment, and said the work was personal. I accepted the explanation without checking the access log or asking whether the materials belonged to the center. The other date was the quarterly assurance I signed afterward. I had certified that there were no unresolved access concerns affecting the program. The sentence looked broader than I remembered writing it. That didn't make it less mine. Dean sat beside me in the review office, hands folded over his phone. He was my oldest friend and the current board chair, which meant loyalty and authority occupied the same chair but didn't carry the same obligation. "It was one kiln slot," he said. "You didn't know about Luis." "I know." "You didn't know about the merchant profile." "I know that too." "Then the assurance wasn't about this." The reviewer looked at me. "Was the exception investigated?" "No." "Was it documented as an exception?" "Not formally." "Did you certify after it occurred?" "Yes." The word landed without drama. That made it worse. I remembered standing beside that kiln, checking the temperature, telling myself that a clean explanation was nearly the same thing as a verified one. I had wanted the interruption gone. I had wanted Mara reassured and the schedule intact. Dean leaned toward me. "You can clarify the scope. You don't need to turn an old operational shortcut into a professional admission." I looked at the copy of my disclosure on the table. The kiln slot wasn't the concealed label, the affair, or the backdated forms. But it was the first time I had chosen reassurance over verification. "I already turned it into one," I said. The reviewer asked whether I could continue managing the center while the review examined my certifications. I knew what I wanted to say. The center needed someone who understood the adaptive program, protected the classes, and could keep the staff from being crushed by the dispute. I also knew that answer would make me argue for my own authority. "I'm recusing myself," I said, "from related certification, sign-off, and management decisions." Dean's expression tightened. "Evan, that leaves the center without its responsible voice. It leaves the review without my conflicted voice." He pushed back from the table. "You're making this easier for everyone who wants you gone." "No," I said. "I'm making the record harder to dismiss." I signed the recusal statement before my courage could become another excuse. The reviewer accepted it and explained that the credential question might require external notification. On the drive home, I understood the first loss clearly. I hadn't been fired, I hadn't lost my license, but I had surrendered the assumption that my signature settled anything. The next morning, the reviewer held a scope meeting in a borrowed office above the center's insurance agent. The room smelled like dust and burnt coffee. Dean arrived 5 minutes late, carrying a folder he kept pressed against his chest. The reviewer placed a short factual statement in front of each of us. "This scope covers access authorization, certification dates, restricted funding, and custody of disputed inventory," she said. "It does not require a history of the marriage." Dean glanced at me. "Some context is unavoidable." "Relevant context is welcome," the reviewer said. "Private detail is not a substitute for evidence." That distinction steadied me. I didn't want Mara's affair turned into a universal explanation. The affair explained concealed access and divided roles. It didn't prove where every dollar went or who changed every form. Dean opened his folder. "The board can resolve the employment and governance questions internally. External review will create confusion before we know whether there's a credential issue." "The credential issue is already within the scope," the reviewer said. "It may not become one." "It may." "That decision isn't the board's." Dean's jaw moved once. He looked at me then, and I recognized the appeal beneath his irritation. He wanted me to remember the first adaptive classroom, the donated ramps, the nights we had painted walls until midnight. He wanted history to function as a vote. I remembered all of it. None of it changed the dates. The statement listed my kiln assurance, the later quarterly certification, Dean's limited pilot approval, and the access forms that appeared after known commercial pickups. It also stated what remained unverified, including the exact source of each private payment. I read every line twice. The word delayed appeared beside my name, and I felt my throat tighten. It was accurate, but accuracy didn't make it painless. "Are you asking me to sign this as accurate?" I asked. "I'm asking whether it accurately states the review scope," the reviewer said. "It does." Dean tapped the page. "You should ask for time." "For what?" "To consult counsel. To coordinate our response. To avoid creating separate accounts that contradict each other." "We don't have separate accounts," I said. "We have separate responsibilities." The reviewer waited. I signed. Dean did not. He requested that his signature be noted as withheld, then asked again that external notification be postponed until the board completed its own inquiry. The reviewer declined. By noon, the credential question had left the center's control. I watched the formal notice being prepared and felt my clean standing become something that existed only in the past tense. The notice arrived at my temporary apartment in a plain envelope with a professional board's return address. I recognized the format before I opened it. My hands stayed steady until the first paragraph used my full name. The reviewer had reconciled the altered access forms with the dates of my certification. The external credential body was opening a review of whether I had delayed correcting an inaccurate assurance. It didn't accuse me of stealing money. It didn't say I had authorized Mara and Luis's entire operation. It said my signature required examination. I accepted service electronically, then sat at the small table until the apartment's heater clicked off. My credential was still active. My clean status was not. I opened the budget on my laptop and looked at the numbers I had avoided since moving out. Rent, insurance, groceries, the payment on my clinical equipment. A credential review didn't have to end my practice to frighten me. It only had to make every future employer hesitate. I reported the notice to the board that afternoon. Dean joined the call from the center. I heard keyboards and a door closing behind him. "This can be handled as one institutional matter," he said. "We should submit a unified defense." What would that include? The commercial work exceeding the pilot, Mara's access, Luis's sales, the things that actually caused the problem. And the altered approval? A pause filled the call. "The timing is disputed," Dean said. "It's visible. It needs context. It needs to be included." Dean lowered his voice. "If we emphasize every internal disagreement, they'll treat the center as a failed control environment." "That's what happened." "That phrase could cost you your practice?" "I know." He inhaled hard. "You're willing to lose everything over paperwork?" "No. I'm unwilling to save my standing with a false account." The call ended without an agreement. An hour later, Mara called from somewhere with traffic moving behind her. She said she'd received word about the notice and wanted to talk privately. I almost said no. Then I remembered that she was still my wife, even though the marriage had become a practical problem before it became a legal one. "Tomorrow," I said. "Somewhere neutral." "Not the center?" "Not the center." She was quiet. "Does this mean you're going to tell them everything?" "It means I'll answer what they ask. And Dean, his choices are his." She didn't argue. That frightened me more than anger would have. I placed the notice beside my disclosure copy. The documents touched at one corner, 2 records connected by the same dates. My income depended on the first. My honesty depended on the second. The mediator's office had frosted windows and a bowl of wrapped mints nobody touched. Mara sat across from me with a legal pad on her knees. She was my wife and the center's weekend sale organizer, but that morning she spoke mostly as the person separating a household. The mediator reviewed practical questions: where we would live, how we would divide ordinary expenses, and how we would communicate about shared obligations. No one discussed blame as a settlement term. Mara had brought a proposed silence clause. "It isn't called that," she said. "It says neither of us makes public statements about the other outside the review." That's silence with better formatting. It protects both of us. It protects the people who need a simple story. Her eyes dropped to the paper. "If you expose Dean's role, he'll say I used you. And then the center will turn on Luis and me." The label could lose every buyer connected to the studio. The label used the studio without full permission, after a limited pilot that Dean approved. I know. You also know the center is in a real deficit. If the conversion vote fails, classes may disappear. Tessa could lose work. People who didn't betray you could lose their livelihoods. That was the strongest argument she had made. It was also the reason the review had to remain accurate. A financial emergency could explain a bad decision. It couldn't convert concealed access into approved use. I won't trade testimony for a marriage, I said. Mara's mouth tightened. I'm not asking you to come back. No. You're asking me to make the institutional record smaller. I'm asking you not to destroy every person attached to it. I won't destroy anyone. I'll separate what I know from what I don't. The mediator asked whether we could proceed without the clause. Mara stared at the legal pad for a long moment, then crossed out the paragraph. We agreed on separate residences, shared payment of the remaining lease, and direct communication about center-related property only. Her label would remain hers. My employment and credential review would remain mine. We left the business question open rather than pretending a marital agreement could decide it. At the door, she said, I did love what we built. So did I. That doesn't make the choices equal. No, I said. It doesn't. She nodded, accepting the boundary without offering forgiveness or asking for it. That afternoon, the reviewer scheduled a funding briefing. The result could clear the most dangerous suspicion against me or prove that the commercial work had consumed money meant for therapy and scholarships. The funding briefing took place in the same plain conference room where I had refused to provide identifiable therapy records. June attended as a long-term member, and Tessa sat near the door with her hands folded over her class notebook. Dean joined remotely as board chair. June had checked the public notices herself before coming. She carried a printed schedule, the anniversary sale receipt, and nothing pulled from a participant file. That small restraint mattered. It reminded me that independent verification didn't require taking everything available. The reviewer read from an interim finding. Based on the records provided, she said, we found no evidence that therapy funds or scholarship funds were used to purchase, produce, or distribute the disputed commercial inventory. A breath moved through the room. I felt relief first. It came quickly and without permission. Then, the rest of the sentence arrived. The finding does not resolve access authorization, altered documentation, delayed conflict disclosure, or inaccurate certification. Dean's voice came through the speaker. So there was no theft. Correct, the reviewer said. That is the financial finding. June leaned forward. Does it establish that the commercial activity was authorized? No. Does it clear the manager's certification? No. Tessa looked at me, not with accusation or comfort. She had always been careful about giving evidence more meaning than it could carry. I thanked the reviewer and accepted the finding for what it was. No therapy money was missing. That mattered enormously. It also didn't make me blameless. When the staff update began, Dean repeated the first sentence before anyone could ask about the second. This confirms the center's protected programs weren't harmed, he said. We should stop treating an administrative dispute as a financial scandal. It confirms one narrow point, I said. We still have to address the access and certification failures. He turned toward the camera. Evan, you're no longer managing the review. I'm not claiming that authority. Then don't use this meeting to prosecute the board. I'm stating the finding accurately. June watched both of us. I could see her testing the shape of the argument, resisting the relief that wanted to become exoneration. After the meeting, she asked me for the public version of the timeline. I can share the receipt, closure schedule, notices, and review findings, I said. Nothing identifying. That's enough to check the sequence, she said. I sent what I could. Before the afternoon ended, the board emailed an employment hearing notice. The subject line used the words delayed disclosure and inaccurate certification. The no theft finding had removed the worst suspicion. It had opened a lawful path to terminate me. I read the notice twice, then began preparing a defense that couldn't depend on being misunderstood. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the employment hearing at my temporary apartment. A non-recurring advisor helped me organize the dates, but she didn't speak for me or promise an outcome. We built the defense around 4 points. I had not authorized the concealed label's full operation. Dean had approved a limited pilot. The access forms appeared later than known commercial use. I had also certified a quarter after tolerating an exception I should have investigated. The 4th point was the one I wanted to soften. The advisor tapped the page. You need to concede the certification failure. I know. Don't describe it as a harmless oversight. I won't. Don't describe it as the cause of everything either. That distinction mattered. A bounded defense required more than admitting fault. It required refusing convenient proportions. I included the customer receipt, the public closure schedule, the inventory categories, the pilot reference, the conflicting dates, and the independent review findings. I identified Mara only where her role explained access or a conflict in the records. I identified Luis as an independent vendor, without implying he had authority over me. I excluded therapy schedules, participant names, and any detail that could let someone reconstruct attendance. The hearing concerned my management and certification. It didn't entitle me to spend other people's privacy as evidence. The advisor asked whether I wanted to mention Tessa's direct observation. Only the access pressure, I said. Her timing statement is already in the authorized record. That keeps her out of a personnel fight. She's already in it. I won't pull her farther. Dean communicated through the board's notice system. His message said the hearing would consider whether I had failed to disclose a known exception and whether my quarterly assurance had been materially inaccurate. He didn't mention the altered forms. I added them anyway. Mara appeared once in the draft, then again where the access dates required her presence. I didn't include the affair as a character judgment. I wrote that the relationship created a conflict I had not separated from my management decisions quickly enough. The sentence made my face heat. It was true. On the second evening, I read the defense aloud. It sounded neither like vindication nor surrender. It sounded like a record written by someone who expected consequences and still wanted the facts to remain proportionate. The advisor closed her notebook. If they accept the no theft finding, they may still terminate you. I understand. Do you want to add anything about your marriage? No. Anything about Tessa's schedule beyond the access pressure? No. She shouldn't have to defend her income in my personnel hearing. I submitted the defense before midnight. The hearing notice gave the board lawful authority to decide my employment. Nothing in my account could turn that authority into a rescue. The next decision would be theirs, and I would have to live with it. The employment session began with the reviewer's narrow finding still visible on the boardroom screen. No therapy money was missing. No scholarship funds had been diverted. The sentence had given me one clean breath, then taken it back. Dean sat at the head of the table as board chair and my oldest friend. June sat across from him with a legal pad she hadn't opened. The other board members joined by video. I had spent the morning reminding myself that lawful authority could still produce a decision I hated. Dean read from the notice. The board finds that Evan Cole failed to disclose a known access exception within a reasonable period and certified quarterly records that were materially inaccurate. I accept both findings in context, I said. I disclosed the full sequence through the independent review. I also recused myself once I understood the certification problem. You recused yourself after the quarter had been certified, Dean said. Yes. And after commercial activity had continued. Yes. He nodded as if each answer strengthened his case. It probably did. June finally looked up. Does the board find that Evan authorized the concealed label's full operation? No, Dean said. Does it find that he stole protected funds? No. Then the proposed employment action concerns oversight and certification. That's correct, Dean said. The words landed more heavily than an accusation. I had wanted proportion. Proportion didn't mean protection. The board voted to terminate my employment, effective immediately. My salary ended that day. My management office, staff authority, signatory access, and institutional privileges ended with it. Dean offered a prepared sentence about preserving public trust. I listened until the sentence became background noise. At the office, I packed my jacket, 2 reference books, and the small mug a group of adaptive program participants had painted for me years earlier. I left the mug. The interim manager stood near the doorway while I signed the equipment return form. Tessa waited outside in the hall. I could see only the edge of her notebook. Do you need copies of anything? She asked. No, I said. I'm not taking records. The old impulse rose anyway. I knew which folders mattered. I knew where the access logs sat and which files could prove the timing. I also knew that copying them after termination would turn correction into unauthorized access. I handed over my keys. The metal felt strangely warm from my palm. At home, the next morning, I woke before the alarm and reached for a schedule that no longer existed. There was no studio opening, no staff briefing, no salary arriving at the end of the week. I lay still until the room stopped expecting me to get up. I moved through the first week by replacing habits with smaller instructions. Make coffee, Answer the credential office, apply for supervised work, don't open the center's systems, don't invent a reason to drive past the loading door. My job intake call took place at the kitchen table. The clinic coordinator asked about my license, my recent management experience, and the terms of the professional review. I'm eligible for supervised clinical practice, I said. I'm not currently eligible to sign independently on the matter under review. There was a pause long enough to make the refrigerator sound loud. Would you accept a supervised position? Yes. The answer felt humiliating for half a second. Then it felt accurate. I sent her the requested documents through the ordinary application portal. I didn't mention Mara's affair or Dean's role. The clinic needed my professional status, not the private wreckage that had surrounded it. The next afternoon, I transferred my remaining operational calendar through the authorized channel, scheduled adaptive classes, kiln maintenance, vendor pickup holds, and the quarterly safety inspection all went to the interim manager. I included notes about deadlines and boundaries, nothing more. The message came back from the center's administrative account. Received. Your access will remain limited to public member information. I read that line twice. The center had once depended on my memory of every loose hinge and canceled class. Now my knowledge had to pass through a boundary I no longer controlled. Tessa called that evening. I'm only giving you a practical update, she said. The Tuesday class is still on. Thursday is uncertain because Dean hasn't confirmed the room. Did he give a reason? He said scheduling is being reviewed. Her voice tightened on the last word. Keep everything in writing, I said. If your class disappears, document the notice and the date. Don't speculate about why. I know. I'm sorry. That part isn't your scheduling problem anymore. The sentence was fair. It still hurt. On Friday, Dean sent a message to the members. I saw it because June forwarded the public portion before my access disappeared entirely. It described me as a former manager whose judgment had been compromised by marital anger. The center, Dean wrote, needed stability while the board evaluated a financially necessary conversion proposal. He didn't call it a blame narrative. He didn't have to. I set the phone face down, then turned it over again. Without the keys, I had no authority to correct the official version. Silence would leave Dean's account standing. The question wasn't whether I could get back inside. It was whether the truth could enter without me pretending I still belonged in charge. Dean's message traveled faster than any correction I could have written. By Monday, members were replying in the email thread. Some defended the center's finances. Others defended Mara. A few asked whether my marriage had influenced the inventory freeze, as if a damaged husband couldn't also read a receipt. I drafted 3 responses and deleted 2. The third said only that the board's message omitted the independent findings limits and that I had requested a procedural opportunity to distribute a factual chronology. I sent it to the membership secretary, not the old staff list. The secretary replied that former employees couldn't use internal channels for advocacy. I'm not asking to advocate, I wrote back. I'm asking for equal distribution of a response to a public statement about my conduct. The request went to Dean. He refused it within an hour. His message said the board would not circulate material from a terminated manager while an employment and credential matter remained open. It added that members could review the relevant summary through the center's normal process. There was no relevant summary attached. I saved the refusal and forwarded it to the independent file. At the center entrance that afternoon, I found Tessa pinning a revised class notice beneath the glass case. Her Tuesday class had moved to a smaller room. Thursday had been listed as pending. Tessa saw me and lowered her hand. I'm here as a member, I said. If that matters, it matters to me. Did Dean say the change was disciplinary? No. He said the room was needed for conversion planning. That was exactly the kind of sentence that could be defended and still function as pressure. Do you want me to record that you told me? I'll record it myself. She took a picture of the notice. I didn't ask for a copy. We met later at a cafe across from the public library. Tessa kept her coffee untouched while I showed her the board's refusal. They're making your marriage the explanation, she said. They're making it convenient. Were you angry? Yes. Does that make the timeline false? No. She nodded once. Then don't ask me to prove what I didn't see. I won't. That boundary was the only honest thing I could offer her. Before we left, June joined us with a folder under her arm. She was a long-term member who checked claims independently and spoke for people afraid of both closure and capture. I'm not distributing your account, she said. Not yet. I understand. I'm going to test both sides against public records. If your chronology fails, I'll say so. Good. June opened the folder. If it holds, I'll request a neutral member packet. My anger had nowhere useful to go. I watched her write down the first date. June chose a library meeting room with frosted windows and a table scarred by years of public use. She brought the center's public notices, the closure calendar, and the operating figures members had already received. I brought the receipt, my termination notice, the independent review's narrow finding, and the written refusal from Dean. Every page came from a public or authorized source. June arranged them by date. Start with what you know directly, she said. I described the customer's refund request, the second merchant profile, the close night timing, and the inventory separation. I explained that the receipt connected the transaction to the center's address, but didn't by itself prove who authorized the sale. June looked at me. And the witness? Tessa reported the arrival time and what she directly observed. She didn't identify the merchant system, the board, or the credential records. Good. The word didn't feel like approval. It felt like a rule. I gave her the public reference to the limited pilot. I told her Dean had admitted approving after-hours commercial testing and that the later access forms conflicted with known pickup dates. I didn't hand her anything that contained protected participant information. Could the deficit be real? She asked. Yes. Could conversion stabilize the center? Possibly. I haven't modeled it. Could your opposition be driven by Mara? Yes, I said. That's one reason I shouldn't be the only person making the case. June leaned back. You're making this difficult to simplify. It is difficult to simplify. She studied me for a moment. You're also asking members to trust someone who certified records inaccurately. I'm asking them not to treat my failure as proof that every other account is true. That earned no smile. June wasn't there to reassure me. We walked to the member notice board after the meeting. She compared the posted conversion announcement with the figures in the packet. The proposal promised new commercial revenue, but didn't yet specify reduced class hours, access rules, or who would control the incubator. Those omissions matter, she said. They do. They may be ordinary omissions in an early proposal. They may. June pressed a thumb against the corner of the paper. I'll verify the deficit and the public timeline. I'll also criticize your delayed disclosure if the evidence supports it. I expect that. Not expect. Accept. I nodded. I accept it. That distinction was harder than it sounded. I had spent months wanting the record to protect me. June was building a record that might not. Before she finished, Dean invited me to a private reinstatement meeting. The message promised a discussion about a constructive path forward. I knew what I needed. I also knew what he could ask for. Dean's board office looked smaller without my access badge clipped to my belt. He had arranged 2 chairs beside the conference table with a folder placed between them. No other board member attended. The absence was deliberate, but it wasn't secret. Dean had stated that the meeting was exploratory and that any agreement required written approval. My oldest friend sat across from me, wearing the expression he used when a kiln alarm threatened a grant deadline. I can recommend reinstatement, he said. As manager? Under a corrective employment plan, salary restored, authority limited while the credential review proceeds. And the report? Dean touched the folder. A clean account of what happened. Mara and Luis created an unauthorized commercial operation. You failed to catch it quickly enough. The board recognizes that distinction. That isn't the full account. It's the accountable account. I opened the folder. The draft said Dean had approved no commercial access beyond a preliminary conversation. It didn't mention the pilot message. It didn't mention forms dated after pickups. It didn't mention that he had centralized the records after confronting him. Tessa's schedule remains under review, he continued. If this becomes a public fight, staff uncertainty will increase. I looked at him. Is that a warning? It's a practical concern. It sounds like leverage. Dean's jaw tightened. You need income, Evan. You need the center's cooperation while the credential matter is open. I'm offering a way to stop this from becoming a spectacle. You're offering my job in exchange for a smaller lie. You already made a larger mistake. Yes, I said. I let Mara use a reserved kiln slot improperly. I told myself it was one exception. I certified the quarter without investigating it. I delayed the conflict disclosure. Those are mine. He watched me carefully. But I won't sign a report that erases your approval or turns Tessa's schedule into pressure. That report protects the institution. It protects the people who controlled the records. For the first time, he stopped sounding like my friend. If you reject this, the board will treat you as responsible for your own outcome. They already did. I took the folder home and marked the omissions. Then I added the complete timeline: receipt, closure date, Tessa's limited timing statement, inventory split, pilot approval, conflicting forms, my certification failure, and the no theft finding. I included no therapy information. I included no private detail about the affair beyond its relevance to concealed access and conflict. At the bottom, I wrote that Dean's reinstatement offer had conditioned restoration on an incomplete account and had raised Tessa's schedule in the same discussion. My hand shook once. I sent the correction before I could reconsider. The salary was gone. The office was gone. Now the friendship was gone, too. What remained could still worsen my reprimand. It could also give June a record strong enough to offer members another choice. The Credential Response Office occupied the second floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and copier heat. I sat beneath a framed statement about professional accountability and read the proposed disposition. Reprimand, supervised practice, no independent signatory authority on related program certifications. The language was severe without being theatrical. That helped. The reviewer asked whether I disputed the factual basis. No, I said. I dispute any implication that I authorized the full commercial operation. I don't dispute that I tolerated an exception and certified afterward. She entered my answer into the record. Are you proposing supervised practice as a condition you can accept? Yes. Even if it affects your income? It already has. She didn't ask about Mara. I didn't volunteer her personal life. The conflict mattered because it had crossed into management, not because the reviewer needed a marriage narrative. I signed the response and left with no restored standing, only a defined path toward work under supervision. Across town, Mara and Luis were presenting their conversion proposal at a public member forum. I watched the beginning through the open library stream, sitting alone near a window. Mara spoke first as the weekend sale organizer and a potter whose label had already drawn buyers. Luis followed as her wholesale partner and an independent vendor with no authority over me. The deficit is real, Luis said. The center needs revenue that can arrive before another grant cycle. He was right about that. Their proposal included a member-facing incubator, paid production access, and a schedule for commercial sales. It also depended on trust they had spent months confusing with permission. A member asked whether disputed stock would be sold through the center. Mara said no, not during the review. She sounded steadier than she had in our apartment. Another member asked whether the proposal required immediate approval. Dean answered from the front table. Delay risks the center's future. The conversion proposal became a formal member question. Approve the commercial transition or reject it and confront the operating deficit through slower fundraising and reduced hours. That was a cleaner question than the private campaign had been. It was also more dangerous. Financial urgency could make bad governance look like courage. June sent me a message afterward. I'm finishing the comparison. I've confirmed the public transaction sequence and the deficit figures. I'm checking the notices against the proposal now. I replied that she should take whatever time the records required. Mara's fiscal argument had become credible ground, even with the concealed access exposed. That mattered because the final decision couldn't rest on punishing her. I closed the credential letter and looked at the forum announcement. The vote was coming. Members would need a viable alternative before urgency made Dean's slate inevitable. I arrived at the member workshop before June finished taping the agenda to the wall. The public meeting room still carried the smell of clay dust and burnt coffee. I had spent years arranging chairs there as the center's manager. But now I sat near the exit without keys, a salary, or authority to move anyone's name on a schedule. June placed 3 stapled packets on the table. Every number has a public source, she said. Every conclusion has a limit. The long-term member who checked claims independently had compared the strange receipt with the posted closure schedule, the center's authorized sales ledger, and the notices for the anniversary event. She had also checked the deficit against the quarterly statements members were allowed to review, and the transaction sequence held. The label had sold after closing. The deficit was real. The center had not lost therapy or scholarship funds, but its governance had failed around access, records, and commercial use, and June's packet said that plainly. It proposed an independent transition committee, reduced operating hours, slower fundraising, written access rules, and a temporary pause on center commerce while the inventory review continued. No protected participant schedules or therapy information appeared because June had removed private claims that could not be tested. Mara and Luis's conversion proposal remained in the packet beside it. June listed its possible revenue and its conflicts without calling it fraudulent or salvation. A member named Carl lifted the comparison. How does slower fundraising keep the doors open? It doesn't solve everything quickly, June said. It keeps urgency from deciding who controls the building. Several people looked at me after that. I felt their suspicion before anyone voiced it. Some members thought I wanted revenge, while others thought I was the only person who understood the center's liabilities. Both views gave me too much credit. Tessa sat with her hands around a paper cup. She was the senior instructor whose classes depended on center access, and the packet gave her a written schedule instead of Dean's daily discretion. Her shoulders lowered when she read that section. That would let me plan the next session, she said. Her voice held no triumph. It held rent, groceries, and the ordinary fear of losing work. June turned the last page toward me. At the bottom, she had written a question for the assembly. Would Evan Cole testify about the affair's relevance to the governance dispute? I stared at the sentence until the room blurred at its edges. The receipt had begun as a refund problem, but it had become the first line of a public chronology. The embrace Tessa witnessed mattered only because access had been concealed around it. I could tell the truth about that boundary. I still had to decide where the boundary ended. The next afternoon, June held a preparation session in the same meeting room. She had arranged the chairs in a circle, though nobody mistook the gathering for therapy. On the wall, the assembly procedures listed speaking limits, motion order, and the rule requiring members to vote on each question separately. I brought my outline in a plain folder. June read the first page. You'll identify the affair? Only where it explains concealed access or a conflict in management. One member wanted more. He had heard that Mara and Luis met at the center after closing and believed the full marital story would prove their dishonesty. I shook my head. The marriage isn't evidence of every transaction. It explains motive, he said. It explains pain, I answered. That isn't the same thing. The sentence settled heavily between us. My outline named the receipt date, the posted closure time, Tessa's limited observation, the separated inventory, Dean's pilot approval, and the later paperwork. It stated that no restricted therapy or scholarship funds were stolen, and it also stated that I had tolerated Mara's earlier kiln violation before certifying the quarter without investigating it. I had written the concession in the first paragraph. June tapped it with one finger. You understand members may use this against you? They should, even if Dean doesn't. Especially then. Tessa had agreed to review only the timing portion. She read it twice, then circled one phrase. You wrote that I saw them arrive together, she said. I saw Mara arrive. Luis was already inside. I corrected the sentence. She continued reading. And I saw an embrace. That's all. That's all you'll be asked to say. Her eyes met mine. Good. Tessa knew the arrival time and the closed night condition, but she didn't know who created the merchant profile, who changed the forms, or what happened to the money. Her restraint had protected the record better than speculation ever could. June took the revised outline and placed it beside the packet. Anything outside this stays out, she said. No protected schedules, no client information, no private messages, no details that exist only to hurt someone. I nodded, because the boundary was necessary even though it left me exposed. The limits felt like a narrow bridge over a deep drop. If I said too little, Dean's jealousy story would fill the silence. If I said too much, I would become another person using private harm as institutional leverage. Members began entering for the evening procedural briefing. They checked the sign-in sheet, collected voting cards, and took seats according to the posted order. The assembly was no longer an argument waiting to happen. It had rules, and those rules gave the testimony a shape that personal anger could not control. That meant Dean could still turn it into a referendum on my motives before the evidence was heard. By evening, the center gallery was full. Mara sat at the front beside Luis, her role marked on the agenda as weekend sale organizer and conversion advocate. Luis was identified as her wholesale partner and an independent vendor with no authority over me. Dean sat behind the board table as chair, June held the procedure packet, and Tessa sat near the instructors, where she could leave without crossing the room. I was listed as former manager. That title was accurate, but it still felt like a bruise. Mara presented the conversion proposal first. She spoke about the deficit, rising supply costs, and the buyers who had already asked for more work from the label. A member incubator could provide revenue without abandoning adaptive classes, she said. We can build a clean system, she said. Paid access, transparent sales, separate inventory, and a real schedule. Her voice tightened around the word clean. Luis followed with projected wholesale figures. He didn't promise a miracle. He described a network of buyers, several vendors willing to participate, and enough early interest to matter. The fiscal case was valid. That was the part I couldn't erase with the affair or the unauthorized sales, because a real deficit remained a real deficit. Then Dean stood. He said the center had been strained by personal conflict. He said my employment termination had followed a professional lapse, and members should be careful about accepting a former manager's account when that manager had been married to one of the people under review. Evan has a personal reason to make this sound larger, Dean said. A few members looked at me. Mara lowered her eyes. Dean proposed an immediate vote before more private accusations poison the institution. June raised her hand. Dean recognized her after checking the speaking order. The posted agenda allows testimony before the conversion motion, she said. The members approved that sequence. Dean's mouth flattened. The sequence can be amended. By motion, June said. Not by pressure. He called for the amendment. The room divided quickly, and the amendment failed by a narrow margin. That left me. I had no request for reinstatement, and no salary waited behind my testimony. The credential reprimand would remain whether members believed me or not. My only remaining choice was whether the record could withstand my voice. June looked toward me. Mr. Cole, you're recognized for bounded testimony. I stood. The gallery quieted, not kindly, but completely. I placed both hands on the table and looked first at Mara, then Dean, then the members who still hoped this could be reduced to one guilty person. I'll speak to what the records establish, I said. I'll also speak to what they establish about me. I won't describe my marriage beyond what explains access, conflict, and the timing of the sales, I said. Mara and I separated after she admitted an affair with Luis. Tessa witnessed one embrace on a closed night. That is the private fact relevant here. Mara's face tightened, but she kept looking at me. The public chronology begins with a customer's refund request. Her receipt came from a second merchant profile using this address. The sale occurred after the building was posted closed, and Tessa's timing placed Mara and Luis inside that night. I held up no paper. June had copies, and the members had the same pages. The inventory count separated center stock, private stock, and disputed pieces. Pickup records showed repeated production. The no theft finding confirmed that therapy and scholarship funds weren't taken. A member asked for confidential schedules to prove the closed nights. No, I said. Protected participant information stays protected. I won't expose clients to settle this dispute. Dean leaned toward his microphone. That refusal leaves the central claim unverified. It leaves private clients out of it, I said. The public schedule already establishes closure. June turned a page. The posted notice, receipt date, and inventory records agree. Dean called the sequence incomplete. He said he had approved only a limited pilot and that Mara and Luis had exceeded it without his knowledge. I faced him. You approved after-hours commercial testing. The pilot message says that. The later forms describe access dates, and those dates came after several pickups had already occurred. That's an interpretation. It's a date comparison. The room stayed quiet. I also failed, I said. I allowed Mara one improper kiln slot. I called it an exception. I didn't investigate before certifying the quarter. I delayed my conflict disclosure. I lost my job and professional standing because those choices were mine. Mara finally looked up. I won't let Dean's approval disappear, I continued. I won't let Mara and Luis carry every consequence. I won't pretend my own conduct was clean. Dean called me jealous. The word landed softer than I expected because it had already been used against me privately. June stood when I finished. There are 3 motions, she said. Conversion now, independent transition with reduced hours and slower fundraising, and removal of the chair for conflicted access control and altered records. The first motion failed. The second passed. The third passed after a long count. A final motion temporarily excluded Mara's label from Center Commerce while the transition committee wrote access rules. It passed too. Dean's chair was gone. Mara's proposal was paused. My job was not restored, and no vote could turn the public consequence into personal vindication. The results came down in separate numbers, each one plain enough to hurt. No one had won the marriage. Over the next 2 weeks, the vote became paperwork, appointments, and uncomfortable ordinary meetings. The Independent Transition Committee reduced operating hours and restored Tessa's classes under written access and anti-retaliation rules. Every vendor would sign in, separate stock, and return tools through the same custody procedure I had once imposed as manager. I attended the credential conference by video from my apartment. The reprimand remained, and supervised practice would begin at a clinic across town under someone else's signatory authority. The reviewer asked whether I wanted to appeal the employment decision. "I want the record accurate," I said. "I'm not appealing to recover management." That answer cost me nothing new, but it still felt like surrender, because the job was gone and no correction would bring it back. Mara and I met through a mediator in a room with frosted windows. She spoke as my wife for the last time in any formal setting, then as a potter planning an off-site business. "The label can survive smaller," she said. "I'm withdrawing the slate." "I know. I'm not asking you to come back." "I know that too." She looked tired, but not defeated. Her buyers had accepted slower production, and Luis would work with her off-site without privilege center access. The business would remain viable at a scale that didn't require the institution to become its warehouse. "I want the transition terms to say that clearly," she added. "The label is mine, but the center is not. That's the right distinction." She studied me. "You sound like a member already." "I'm trying to learn how." Dean submitted a short acknowledgement to the transition committee. Financial fear had led him to conceal conflicts and control information after the pilot exceeded its limits. He kept his membership and lost the chair. He didn't contact me. That was probably the most honest thing left between us, because neither of us could turn silence into a claim of restored friendship. June sent members the final schedule and a plain summary of the vote. She removed my name from the manager's contact line. Under member concerns, she wrote that the center would remain open fewer hours while fundraising continued. I read the notice twice. The reduced schedule was a consequence, not a victory, and the transition would have to work without the certainty that any of us had once mistaken for control. If this story's hard-won honesty stayed with you, share it with someone who believes accountability should include the person telling the truth. 3 weeks after the assembly, I returned for an ordinary member session. I paid the fee at the desk and signed the tool sheet. No one called me manager. A few people still moved aside when I entered, as if authority might return through habit. I carried my own bag to a wheel and waited for June to explain the evening's limits. Morning had become practical by then. That was the only form of healing I trusted. The center opened for 4 reduced hours evenings each week. On my first session, Tessa taught the adaptive class in the next room. Her schedule was posted beside the entrance, protected by written access rules instead of Dean's discretion. June checked the sign-in sheet and reminded me that members paid for clay by weight. I paid, and the authorized receipt printed from the center's system. I folded it into my wallet, then almost laughed at the habit. The first receipt had exposed a hidden life. This one recorded nothing except that I belonged there for 2 hours, within rules that applied to everyone. Mara stopped by before class ended. She carried no center inventory and wore the badge marked Vendor, Off-Site, for a meeting with June. "My slate is withdrawn," she said. "The label's running from Luis's space now." I heard. "We're separated, formally." I nodded. There was no apology left that could repair the marriage, and no cruelty required to prove it was over. She glanced at the wheel. "That piece is yours?" "For tonight." She gave a small, tired smile and left before either of us turned the exchange into hope. Dean arrived later as a member. He signed the same sheet I did. His chair authority was gone, his keys were gone, and his acknowledgement sat in the transition file. He kept his place in the community without keeping control of it, which was the proportionate consequence he had resisted. Tessa finished her class and checked the locked cabinet herself. She no longer needed to ask whether a late pickup had been approved, because June had made the procedure visible. I worked quietly. The clay resisted my hands, then softened beneath steady pressure. I wedged it against the table and formed a modest cup, uneven at the rim. Nobody praised it, and nobody asked me to solve anything. At closing, I wiped the wheel, weighed the remaining clay, and signed out the tools. The custody sheet carried the same columns I had created months earlier: center stock, private stock, disputed pieces, and returned. The receipt was archived. The pickup records were separated. The timing statement remained limited and credible. Dean's pilot became written governance. My certification lapse became a reprimand and supervised practice. Mara's label continued elsewhere, smaller and honest about where it worked. June handed me the closing key by mistake. For 1 second, my old hand closed around it automatically, remembering the weight and the authority that had once traveled with it. Then I passed it back. "I'm not the key holder," I said. She nodded and signed the return line. I stepped outside while the lights clicked off behind me. I had lost the salary, the office, the marriage, and the certainty that belonging meant possession. The center was still open. I walked home as an ordinary member, carrying my crooked cup toward a future that asked less of me and required more honesty. Which leaves me to thank you, the viewers, for watching, and to remind us all that true freedom blossoms only when we courageously embrace the truth. How did you feel about the choices these characters made, and will you subscribe to Infidelity Director for more stories?